Now turn to gentleman from California for 5 minutes.
I appreciate that. Would you play the short video?
For top executives to award themselves these kinds of compensation packages in the midst of this economic crisis isn't just bad taste, it's bad strategy, and I will not tolerate it as president. We're going to be demanding some restraint in exchange for federal aid, so that when firms seek new federal dollars, we won't find them up to the same old tricks. As part of the reforms we're announcing today, top executives at firms receiving extraordinary help from U.S. taxpayers will have their compensation capped at $500,000, a fraction of the salaries that have been reported recently.
Ms. Kagan, did you fully live up to the words that the President said in that speech?
Chairman Issa?
Could you pull the microphone a little closer?
Chairman Issa, if you recall, after the President's speech, Congress amended Issa.
Okay, so, and since my name is normally pronounced Issa, I'll interrupt at this moment. I agree. The statute does not exactly match the President's statement. So let's get into what the statute is supposed to do. You're authorized to provide such compensation, and I've done executive compensation actually greater than the $10 million that we're talking about for the top. You're authorized to get them effectively to the median, but you're also required to have a deferral. They're not allowed to receive it all in cash. Is that essentially what a layperson would think about the law relative to GM and the old GMAC, which are the only two entities we're talking about really here today?
Chairman Issa, I agree. Our two main guidelines would be to make sure that the compensation does not exceed the levels paid for similar positions at similar companies on the one hand, and we want to make sure that most of the compensation is in the form of stock so that it's paid over time and reflects the performance of the company over time, so that the executives are not encouraged to look at short-term results and are not encouraged to take excessive risks.
And if you're an executive making $500,000, $1 million, $2 million, the truth is it's not a negative, it's a positive to receive your compensation on a deferred basis. Correct? In other words, companies routinely do not pay their top executives in large amounts of cash. Just the opposite. Executives typically want a deferred compensation package, and many of the compensation that top executives get are in non-cash deferred systems, including their pensions and so on. Isn't that true?
Chairman Issa, that's correct. In our case, however, the cash portion of the packages is a much smaller portion than is normal for similar positions at similar companies.
Well, I took the opportunity to look at General Motors' chief competitor, Ford. And when you look at Ford, it outperformed GM. When you look at the total compensation, I found it to be substantially similar. The difference is Ford has much lower debt, owes the government nothing, is in fact competing against General Motors, who got a bailout. Isn't that correct?
Generally speaking, I believe that you're correct in describing their compensation.
And because America chose, or the Treasury chose, to have a substantial portion of that bailout in stock, it's particularly significant because it doesn't appear as debt on the balance sheet, but rather stock that is currently underwater by about $20 billion, right? More or less.
The stock that we own at current market prices is not sufficient for GM to repay us fully. That's correct.
Well, let's understand something. General Motors is a public company, so we've lost that much money. If we take that money and we sell it and we put it into Apple or we put it into gold futures or anything else, we may or may not make money. The truth is, today we have lost that much money, and the only way we get it back is through stock appreciation, correct?
It is true that the only way we will get the remaining investment in GM is through the value of our stock. That's correct,
Okay.
Chairman Issa.
Now, I've sat on the board of a public company, even as a member of Congress, and I'm very sensitive to what moves the value of stock. Since your compensation package was deferred almost not at all, in other words, they vest in 3-year increments, a third, a third, and a third, can you sit here today and tell the rest of us who do not always deal in these kinds of things that they're really linked to the long-term future Is next year, the year after, and the year after long-term, or is in fact 3 years after the bailout, or 6 years after the bailout nearly, is it in fact really long-term, or are we dealing with a relatively short horizon, one in which the CEO, for example, is likely to still be the CEO or barely exiting? That's the question I really have for you here today. It's not the total compensation, which I have some concerns about whether it's fair based on their performance relative to their peer who didn't have the assistance. But even if it was reasonable, why wouldn't that compensation, the so-called TARP stock, be more linked to us getting out of the red on that very stock?
Chairman Issa, the task that the Office of the Special Master has under the law is to achieve a balance between limiting compensation on the
Well,
one
my
hand.
time has expired, but maybe because you're not exactly answering the question, if you could simply say, did you have the authority to go beyond a third, a third, and a third? Not could you exercise it, did you choose to, but did you have the authority to have their compensation further out and more linked to the long-term performance than you did?
Chairman Issa, we did select 3 years as the appropriate long-term measure.
I appreciate that you selected it. And, Mr. Chairman, if you and Ranking Member, if you give me a little indulgence, did you have the authority to have their compensation more linked to where the company would be when it exits, us being on the hook and upside down and currently having lost potentially forever our investment? Did you have the authority to make it longer than essentially a third of it maturing in 1 year?
Chairman Issa, we could have made it longer and we could have made it shorter. You are correct.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, hopefully I've set the stage a little bit for one of my concerns today is exercise of authority. Was it reasonable? Thank you. I yield back.